So again, welcome. You're joining us online live or later on, and those of you here in our session today, we, as you probably got a chance, if you got the reading in, get into some of the sometimes more unsavory reading as we read about Joshua's explanation of the conquest, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we journey through. But let's open up to page 6 in the student book, and we can join together in the opening prayer. Let's pray. Creator of all and Lord of time and eternity, as we begin our study of the history of your people within the promised land, grant us the guidance of your Holy Spirit as we ponder challenging questions and profound answers. Teach us, O Lord, that we live on a planet that belongs to you. Open our eyes to see the seductions of sin around us. Grant us wisdom to understand the nature of the battle to which you summon us. Fill us with compassion to care for all who are near to us and far from us. Enlighten our minds to understand the nature of the battle that Jesus, your Son and our Savior and Lord, fought on our behalf. Grant wisdom to the rulers of this world so that they might understand your divine peace plan for life in this present world. Keep us in your forgiving grace until that day comes when you welcome us into a peace-filled eternal Eden that you have prepared for us. We pray in the name of our gracious, forgiving, victorious Savior, your Son and our heavenly brother. Amen. Well, let's begin with the review from the last section, which had all of one picture. Somebody want to read 11A, and just somebody else can read bullet points so we can share that.
The closing chapters of Numbers describe the Israelites destroying several enemy nations in the region to the east of the Jordan River. Although one might expect the next book, Deuteronomy, am I in the right place? Yeah.
Yep.
So to describe the people entering the promised land, it does not. It depicts Moses speaking earnestly to the Israelites preparing to cross the Jordan River and conquer Canaan. Throughout Deuteronomy, Moses stresses that the Israelites are not to take for granted that they will possess the promised land forever. God, who rescued his people in the Exodus and made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, calls them to obedience. If they ignore his call, they will lose both the favor of God and the land they are about to enter. Therefore, the Israelites are to let nothing interfere with their loyalty to God.
All right, somebody pick up the rest of that.
Key themes of Deuteronomy are the land that the people are about to enter belongs to God. Whether or not the people remain in the land will depend on whether they obey the stipulations of the Sinai covenant. The people are to worship the Lord alone. When they enter the land, the people are to worship the Lord at one central sanctuary. If the people render the Lord due honor and obedience, they will be blessed. If they do not, they will be cursed. God's presence at Sinai has been awesome and overwhelming, and that presence continues to live in the midst of Israel. Indeed, the people are to see themselves as living constantly in the shadow of Sinai and are to choose life each and every day.
Okay. And so again, the picture here has a Moses figure holding a covenant, and you see the 6 parts of the covenant listed, and hopefully those are getting embedded in your minds some. And you also see Mount Sinai down at the bottom, and then sort of a shadowy Mount Sinai across on the east side of the Jordan River. And then those statements of the land alone, the Lord alone, one sanctuary, blessings and curses, choose life today. Those aren't the only repetitive themes that we encountered in Deuteronomy, but they occur. They're kind of like the central focal points, and they'll also, as you see, play out and the narratives that we'll be following over the next sessions here. So any questions on the picture? The other thing with the picture, particularly with that sort of mini version of the Sinai and the community there, is kind of this reminder that Sinai travels with them. And they keep that always in mind. And so that whole Exodus experience is central to their understanding. Somebody take the 3 bullets in 11b.
The first 11 chapters of Deuteronomy contain introductory materials that deal with both historical and legal issues. Chapters 12 through 26 contain what scholars refer to as the Deuteronomic Code. They spell out many deals that define obedience to God's laws. Deuteronomy's final 8 chapters deal with issues relating to blessings and curses, the transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua, and Moses' death.
Okay, kind of a very simple summary. Somebody take the next one.
Although there is much historical overlap between Deuteronomy and the 4 books that precede it, Genesis through Numbers, Deuteronomy meshes well with and includes greatly the contents of the historical books that follow Joshua through 2 Kings.
And so that is interesting that the themes that emerge in Deuteronomy will show up again and again and again in the narratives that follow. And at least in terms of that narrative track, as that opening sentence with 11a pointed out, that all of a sudden, instead of the narrative continuing, it kind of stops with Deuteronomy, and the themes getting raised will be important as we go forward. Next one.
The themes of the 6-part structure of the covenant God made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai surface repeatedly within Deuteronomy. The work presents itself as a farewell speech from Moses, who passionately urges the Israelites to take the Sinai covenant seriously. If they do not, they will suffer dire consequences.
Pretty self-explanatory. And then one last little sentence. 11e.
Deuteronomy contains many words and phrases that are not found in Genesis through Numbers, but are found in the historical writings that follow it, Joshua through 2 Kings.
So again, that's a part of that connection that was referenced earlier in 11c. And however your particular Bible translation renders those words, so if it talks about the statutes and the ordinances, then you're going to run across statutes and ordinances sort of all through. Others will say commandments, whatever it is, that translation appears multiple times. So any questions on that? Okay. So we're now going to move to the conquest, at least as it's described in the book of Joshua. And so again, we've finished this first section of the Jewish Bible, which is called the Law, the Torah. And we're now moving into the next section, and the first book of the next section called the Former Prophets. Your text will talk about that a little bit, so we'll look at that in a moment. But as we move forward, and we already got some of it in the narrative that precedes us, we're going to spend some time over these next weeks looking at some pretty brutal narratives. If you got a chance to read through Joshua, you've read through some of those. And it's helpful, I think, to talk about this in a couple of different kinds of ways. One is this. And perhaps most important, and you may have heard me talk about this before, Martin Luther would talk about the hidden God and the revealed God. And he would go on to say that the hidden God is often mysterious, difficult to understand, and often will lead to sort of fear and despair or worry or concern, or just kind of he wouldn't have said it this way, we would say it in this culture, just sort of an all-encompassing kind of ick or yuck sometimes. And so he would always argue that what we have to flee to is the revealed God. And of course, the scriptures, and we'll get to this when we get to the New Testament, the scriptures, Jesus is God in the flesh. And so just be aware that as you read some of these narratives and you just kind of go, yeah, I don't like this, that you're often bumping up against the hidden God, and we don't always understand, we can't always make sense of it. So there's that aspect to it. I also think it's important, I forget who told me this years ago, but it sounds a little funny, but I think it's valuable. And that is, you don't always have to like what you read in the Bible. You don't have to say, "Ooh, boy, I want to read that 5 more times." And so we read it, we take it, we try to understand it and fathom it, but it isn't always something that you have to say, "Boy, I really like this." What about the battles that occur? In general, we will make a distinction between battling when someone's attacking us and we have to fight back. That often feels more justified to us, right? As opposed to if we're the ones in bringing about the devastation. And so just be aware that that's a kind of a reality for us as humans, that we can, we don't necessarily like violence. Hopefully, we don't like violence, but we can seem to make sense out of violence when we are the ones being attacked and we have to fight back. And it's a little more difficult to make some sense out of the ones where it doesn't seem like maybe the others have done anything and they're just somehow being attacked or obliterated. On the flip side of that, and it referenced it here in this little summary, and let me see here. In 11D, it talks about how if the people take the covenant seriously, it will go well, but if they don't, they will suffer dire consequences. And I don't know that we have, so one of the things that I do, maybe this will be helpful. One of the things I do with some of these narratives that we're going to be looking at is I want to remind myself that God takes idolatry very seriously. And that the reason under the rubric of holy war, and by the way, in chapter 20, we'll spend a whole section on war, so we won't get all of that. And it's interesting, it's right next, it's called worship and war. So 2 broad themes that show up in the Pentateuch. But the idolatry is a big deal. And the reason the Israelites are not supposed to intermingle with the other nations is because of their idolatry. And the warnings are, if you marry their daughters or if you give your daughters to them, you will intermingle and you will soon worship their gods. And of course, that's exactly what happens as the narrative continues. And so we're going to not only read about sort of destruction of peoples, but God's people themselves are going to experience significant destruction. We saw some of that already in the wilderness wanderings, where they weren't taking God seriously. So somehow you hold this stuff in tension, and but we tend to, in these more modern times, if you want to call them that, we like to get kind of soft on that and don't recognize the significance and the importance of trusting in the Lord alone and no other gods. So we'll see that. The other piece is, and we'll get a chance to look at this, Joshua and Judges don't necessarily tell the conquest story in the same way. So we're working through the Joshua narrative now, but when we come back and circle around next time into the book of Judges, we're going to read something a little different. And we'll talk more as we work our way through. So here we are in the book of Joshua. So we're going to use the illustration, and there's only the one in this lesson, to kind of give us a quick walk through Joshua. And before we do that, here's our timeline, right? So we're working our way through. We had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Then they get into Egypt. Then they have the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings. And then this little black number 1 in this kind of multicolored section here from about 1200 to not quite 1000 is the period of the Judges. And so if you look back in the timeline, up in this upper left-hand section, here are the listing of the names of the judges. And they're simply the numbers there represent the various judges. We'll get to those next time, but notice judge number 1, Joshua. So in our timeline here, then we're kind of in this little section right here. So right after the Exodus, the time through the wilderness, and now we're looking at this section in the promised land. So we'll invite you to pay attention to the screen, Joshua. Okay, so in that upper left-hand side of the illustration, this would be Joshua, as it mentions point number 1 on page 15, Joshua blowing the ram's horn, the shofar. So if you ever hear people talk about a shofar, that's the Hebrew word for ram's horn. And Joshua is the one who's calling the people to battle. And what's going on, right? So here's just sort of a map of the promised land, and here's what we've gotten to date. So watch the little, gotta watch, there's a little animation here, so don't miss it. Oh, it didn't go. Come on. Let's do it this way. Come on. Hey, how come you're not animating for me like you were before? Nuts. Come on. Oh, it's supposed to. There it is. Do you see that? There. Okay. I thought, oh man, I really goofed it up. So what has happened so far is where we're at is they've wandered up now to over by Mount Nebo and Abel Shittim, and they have conquered what's referred to as the East Bank, right? So north in this map is up and down. So the west side of the Jordan River is on the other side, and the east side is the side that they're on. And so here's their little, estimated travel path. And they stop here and they've kind of wiped out these people. And remember, these people were the ones who attacked them as they wanted to pass through the land. They said, no, you can't pass through. They mustered their armies to fight against the Israelites. And so they fought back. And so we may not like the fact that they sort of obliterated all the people on that side, as it's described in the narrative. But they were attacked. And so we give, that one's a little easier to stomach for us. I'll see if I can keep going here. So what's going to happen next is they're getting ready to cross over. Do you see that tiny little thing from Abel Shittim to Gilgal? Right? See where that's going? And it's really hard to see. You can look on your map a little bit better, and you'll see that little pile of 6 dots. Right? Because when they cross the river, and we'll read this, when they cross the river, they set up a little altar of stones, right? And then from there, they go out into Jericho, right? And they battle Jericho, they battle Ai, and so you've got that little section in white that they conquer and control. We will then read about how they head south and kind of work their way into that territory, taking control, and then they work their way north and they end up taking control. Sorry, Sissy, I can't talk. And so this is a map of what's happening in the territory, what's going on in the Joshua narrative. And we usually associate Joshua with the conquest, okay? And centered in there in that little circle that is drawn is the Ark of the Covenant with a sword. Because as we read some of these narratives, it's clear that God is fighting on the side of the Israelites. And that sometimes the Israelites are part of the mop-up campaign, right? And there's some miraculous things that we'll read about a little bit. And then Shiloh. And that's circled here because Shiloh is going to be a place where some covenant things happen. And when we get into the king's narrative, we'll be referencing Shiloh. So this is one of the kind of first holy places. But remember, the book of Deuteronomy would say over and over again that, they're defined the place. It's never mentioned. We know, of course, that place will eventually be Jerusalem. But until they get there, these are the things that are happening. So and then this little altar that's built here, when the East tribes finally, it's supposedly all conquered, and they go back, they build this little altar, and there is some controversy about that. And then they have a little covenant renewal ceremony at the end. But that's our text where we're going. Let's actually dive into the book of Joshua. And we won't get to read, there's 24 chapters. We won't get to read all of them, but we will get to read a significant portion of it as we go along. So as Joshua begins, somebody read the first 9 verses of Joshua chapter 1.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
Okay. And that last line, I do have confirmation students who choose that, right? And it's referenced numerous times. Be strong and courageous. Well, of course, if you're going to need to be strong and courageous, and you're told that numerous times, chances are you're going to be encountering some challenging and difficult things. But this is a transition now from Moses to Joshua. And the promise is given that God is going to be with him. And think about the promise that we heard to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, to Moses, and now to Joshua. That gets repeated numerous times. So it's a part of that continuity there that's happening. And also notice that you have this sense of, in verse 7, be careful to act in accordance with all the law. And then you get in verse 8, the book of the law. And we're not exactly sure what that all entails at that point, but that's where we're beginning. So somebody finish chapter 1.
Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, pass through the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for in 3 days you are to cross over the Jordan. Go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess. To the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest, and will give you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock shall remain in the land that Moses gave you beyond the Jordan. But all the warriors among you shall cross over armed before your kindred and shall help them. until the Lord gives rest to your kindred as well as to you. And they too take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving them. Then you shall return to your own land and take possession of it, the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan to the east. They answered Joshua, all that you have commanded us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your orders and disobeys your words, whatever you command shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous.
Okay, there's that same theme. Do some of you have something? Let's see, where is it here? In verse 14, do some of you have east of the Jordan rather than beyond the Jordan? Okay, that was the same thing we referenced before in looking at Deuteronomy. And then what do you have at the end of 15? Do you have east twice? Or do you have beyond the Jordan? Because mine says beyond the Jordan to the east. So does yours say east of the Jordan to the east? What have you got at the end of 15? Those of you who didn't have beyond the Jordan.
Only then may you settle here on the east side of the Jordan River in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you.
So they leave the second east out. Okay. So here's the setup, right? Those tribes, looking at the picture here, those tribes who had said, this land that we just conquered is perfect for us, we want to stay here, are told they can do that if they will be willing to cross the Jordan and help lead the fight against the Canaanites so that they can take the land. So here is what is being referenced. Okay. And then chapter 2, what happens next? You got a heading there? Spies. Sent where? Right. So if you look at the map here, the first significant place that they're going to come into is Jericho, right across the Jordan here. And why are they sending out spies? Well, you got to do a little reconnaissance, right? And yet, the story. Did they need the reconnaissance? Not really. And so some scholars have wondered, why is this in here? Because it isn't like they used the information that they got from the spies. But what is the connection is that Rahab, the harlot, and her family now become incorporated into the Israelite community. So it is interesting. So just keep this as an example, right? They're crossing over into that enemy or whatever Canaanite territory, and we got it in our head they're supposed to obliterate everyone, but right away there's an exception to the rule. And interestingly enough, she doesn't have the kind of profession that we think good upstanding people ought to have. And maybe you know the story a little further as well. She's going to be in the family tree of David, which means she's also in the family tree of Jesus. Okay. And in fact is mentioned in the New Testament. So we won't necessarily read all of this, but in chapter 2, these spies are sent, right? And they go to a prostitute's house, and why? Well, probably because that would be a house where lots of people would be entering and exiting. So that might not be so strange. But we're also told that there is great fear in the land because of the Israelites. And so they kind of make this deal that if she doesn't betray them to the authorities, they will allow her and the ones that she brings into her home to survive the destruction that's going to come. Okay. Any questions on chapter 2? All right. So at the very end of chapter 2, when they come back, they report that God is going to give the land in our hands. And remember back in the Numbers narrative where they were right up and they sent spies into the land, one from each tribe. And those spies came back saying, it is a land of milk and honey. It is a land of great abundance, but it's also a land that is, yeah, there are giants there. We saw giants. I mean, it's so fortified, there's no possible way we can do it, right? And so that's why the spies gone 40 days. That's why they're going to wander in the wilderness 40 years. But of the 12 spies, 2 brought back good reports. Well, they don't send 12, they send 2, and they bring back the report saying the people are scared to death of us. And so now they're going to cross the Jordan. And remember, it's Shittim, if you want to pronounce it. You can certainly just say S, but somebody pick up and read chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. But you'll have to read louder than that.
Early in the morning, Joshua rose and sent out from Shittim with all the Israelites, and they came to the Jordan. They camped there before crossing over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it, so that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, a distance of about 2,000 cubits. Do not come any nearer to it. Then Joshua said to the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. To the priests, Joshua said, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on in front of the people. So they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went in front of the people. The Lord said to Joshua,
And I'll stop you there. So this is the prep to go in. And the priests are going to carry the Ark of the Covenant. God's going first, right? God's leading you through. But they got to keep some distance. How long's a cubit? Anybody remember? No, a cubit's about 1.5 feet, 18 inches. So it's essentially from your finger to your elbow. It's kind of a human measuring thing. So 2,000 cubits would be about 3,000 feet, which is divide by 3, 1,000 yards, which is 3 or 10 football fields. That's pretty far distance, right? You get to wondering, boy, you hope the people in the front had good vision, because that'd be so far away you might not even be able to see it. But anyway, it's that sense of that holiness, and you can only get so close before you're have crossed that boundary. But they're going to go and they're going to lead the people across. All right, somebody take 7 to 13.
The Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you, as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the Ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will cut off and stand up in a heap.
Okay. Did you notice how many people groups are named in that little section? 7. Yep. And it isn't always going to be exactly the same, but there's this sort of sense of 7 foreign nations. And we're going to see this, for example, when we get to the feeding of the 4,000 mostly Gentiles of Jesus. He does the 5,000 feeding of the 5,000 with the 5 loaves, 2 fish. We're used to that one. And there's 12 baskets left over, 12 Israelite tribes, 12 baskets. When he feeds among the Gentiles, there's 7 baskets left over. So just keep track of that number a little bit there. So they're going to go across, right? And kind of 2 things are happening. Not only are they going to cross the Jordan, but this is going to elevate Joshua in the eyes of the people. Remember, they've been following Moses for all these years, and now there's a new leader. Sometimes when there's a new leader, it takes a little while for the people to get used to that. So keep that in mind as we progress here in our congregation. But anyway, when they get ready, when the priests, the Levites step in, the water's going to stop. Somebody else pick up from there and read to the end of the chapter.
The people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan. The priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. So when those who bore the Ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap far off at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, while those flowing toward the sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan.
So there's lots of points you could make, depending on how much of this text you've studied before. You'll notice that the water doesn't stop until they step into it, right? So there's a sense of taking God at his word, even if what we see doesn't quite seem accurate. Of course, they crossed the sea. That was the final event in the Exodus that freed them from slavery. Now they're crossing the river to get into the promised land. Anybody ever been over to Israel? I have not, but I'm told that the flow, we think like the Mississippi is this big giant river. The Jordan isn't like that. And I remember hearing one of my mentors talk about how that when he crossed over from Jordan to Israel and went over the Jordan River, that the front of the bus hit Israel before the back of the bus had left Jordan. So it's not necessarily super wide, but interestingly enough, this is the time of the flood, so it's probably spreading out more than that. But the miracle, of course, is not just that the water stopped, but that mushy ground became dry and they could cross over. And as they do so, they're given some instructions. Somebody take the first 7 verses of chapter 4.
When the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, select 12 men from the people, 1 from each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood, carry them over with you and lay them down in the place where you camp tonight. Then Joshua summoned the 12 men from the Israelites whom he had appointed, 1 from each tribe. Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, 1 for each of the tribes of the Israelites, so that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off in front of the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the Israelites a memorial forever.
All right, so then that's the meaning of that little tiny pile of stones here, just on the other side in your picture. Okay, somebody take 8 through 13.
The Israelites did as Joshua commanded. They took up 12 stones out of the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites. as the Lord told Joshua, carried them over with them to the place where they camped, and laid them down there. Joshua set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. The priests who bore the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people crossed over in haste. As soon as all the people had finished crossing over the ark of the Lord, and the priests crossed over in front of the people, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh crossed over armed before the Israelites, as Moses had ordered them. About 40,000 armed for war crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for battle.
Okay, so not only do they stack a pile of stones on the dry land, but apparently they stack a pile of stones in the middle of the river, and the writer here is telling us they're still there. So this, it's kind of interesting. But again, that phrase about how, they are here until to this day, right? That will, again, give us a sense that at some level, some of this text is written after the events have occurred. The other thing, and this is the sort of an artistic challenge, if you will. If you ever see any illustrations of the people crossing the Jordan River, they never show the people 2,000 cubits away from the priests. I mean, they're walking kind of right next to them, because it wouldn't work. You'd either have this really tiny picture with these people way off to the side. So again, it's hard to know exactly how that all comes together. But here in verse 12 and following, those 2.5 tribes that are going to stay on that east side are leading ahead. Hard to tell if the 40,000 armed are just from those 2.5 tribes, or if that's all the things. And again, the numbers in the Bible, as we work through this narrative from Egypt onward, it's challenging to know. Is that literally the number at the point in which the story is being told, or is it that cumulative number because the Jews, all subsequent Jews, would see themselves as having taken part in these events? It's a little difficult to ferret all of that out. And what happens? Well, verse 14 tells us then, on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, as they stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. So Joshua's position is solidified as a result of what we read here. Okay. And somebody else take 15 to the end of the chapter.
The Lord said to Joshua, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant to come up out of the Jordan. Joshua therefore commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. When the priests bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord came up from the middle of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet touched dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east side of Jericho. Those 12 stones which they had taken out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal, saying to the Israelites, when your children ask their parents in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know. Israel crossed over the Jordan here on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Great Sea, which he dried up for us until we crossed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and so that you may fear the Lord your God forever.
Okay, so that pile of stones is a reminder, right? It's a witness in a sense. And then comes a rather strange little narrative. It's not so strange at the beginning of 5 where it says, when all the kings of the Amorites beyond the Jordan to the west and all the kings of the Canaanites by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the Israelites until they crossed over, their hearts melted and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the Israelites. So this sense of, oh boy, we're in for this, right? But here comes the narrative that's a little confusing, or puzzling is maybe a better word. So I'll read. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites a second time. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haaraloth. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the warriors, had died during the journey through the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt. Although all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people born on the journey through the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. So, for the Israelites traveled 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the warriors who came out of Egypt, perished, not having listened to the voice of the Lord. To them, the Lord swore that he would not let them see the land that he had sworn to their ancestors to give us. Notice how it went from them to us. A land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. When the circumcising of all the nation was done, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. The Lord said to Joshua, today I've rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt, and that place is called Gilgal to this day. And Gilgal is related to a Hebrew word, galal, that means roll, right? But so essentially, anybody who was in Egypt had been circumcised. And when they came through out into the land, anyone who was 20 years up and older, remember, would die. They're the warriors. They would die. But there were children born during that course of time, and for some mysterious reason that we are not given information to, they were never circumcised. And yet you think, I mean, Moses was the one who was like on top of trying to make sure that the laws were kept. It's just puzzling. We don't know, but it's taken care of here. And even more significantly, somebody read 10 through 12.
While the Israelites were camping in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening of the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on that day. They ate the produce of the land. And the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year.
So there's your bookend. What was the night they left Egypt? Passover. Remember? They're in the promised land now, and they celebrate Passover. They don't know what they're going to eat in the wilderness. Manna. They get into the promised land and begin to eat the produce of the land. The manna's done. So it's like this is sort of a chapter. It's bookended, and they've now entered into a new time in their life. Okay. And what's interesting then is what comes at the end of chapter 5. Somebody take 13 to the end.
Once when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you one of us?" He replied, "Neither. But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. And he said to him, "What do you command your servant, my lord?" The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so.
Sound familiar?
No, I'm confused. What?
Moses at the burning bush.
Oh, he was told to take his shoes.
He's told to take his shoes off. for he stands on holy ground. So Joshua is Moses' successor. And so these parallels are being drawn with this kind of new time in their history, and yet it's a continuation of what had happened before. Just as they continue with the celebration of the Passover, so they continue with a leader who was in the presence of God and was told to remove his shoes. So we are 5 chapters into Joshua, and what have they conquered in the promised land? Nothing. And maybe you saw it, or maybe you read it in your text. But by and large, there's only 5 chapters out of the 24 in Joshua that talk about the conquest. And we sometimes in our head say, oh yeah, Joshua's all about conquering the promised, but well, it's not all about conquering the promised land. There's other things in here as well. Again, doesn't take away all the sting of some of the, the destruction that will happen, but it does kind of point it out. Now, Jericho, you probably got a song going through your head as soon as I mention the word song with the name Jericho. But Jericho's shut up. It's a walled city, and they've closed it down. And what are the people supposed to do to what's God's instructions to them? Well, let's read. It takes chapter 6, 1-7.
Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go in or out. But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king and all its mighty warriors. Your entire army is to march around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you are to march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing their horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the horns, have all the people give a mighty shout. Then the walls of the city will collapse, and the people can charge straight into the city. So Joshua called together the priests and said, take up the Ark of the Covenant and assigned 7 priests to walk in front of it, each carrying a ram's horn. Then he gave orders to the people, march around the city, and the armed men will lead the way in front of the Ark of the Lord.
All right. And so there's the battle plan. Here's how you're going to conquer this walled city. You're going to march around it. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. On day 7, you're going to go around it 7 times. And then you're beginning to think perhaps, what's happening with the Sabbath? It's not mentioned, but somewhere, I mean, it doesn't tell us what day they started, but somewhere in there, it's the Sabbath, but they've been ordered to march. And on that 7th day, does this sound like a battle? It's a long hike. It's a religious procession, right? Have you ever been any place where there's been like a Corpus Christi procession? Maybe, or you've seen pictures of those kinds of things. This is a long religious procession. And it's much more of a religious procession than it is a battle plan, right? Why? Because their God is going to do it. They're not going to destroy, the walls of Jericho or tear them down, but instead, God is taking care of that. They're just going to go mop up afterwards. And remember, of course, that Rahab, it lives within the wall itself. There's dwellings, and we don't know how many stories there might be, but so you've got that happening as well. And even though Rahab had a roof, right? Because that's where the spies were hidden, where she was drying the flax up on the roof. So it's a little difficult, but normally there's multiple layers depicted in this. And so when that whole thing collapses, you have to imagine there's a lot of death already before they've even entered into the town. And so that's what happens. They march and they go and they blow their trumpets. And then finally we get to the 7th day by verse 15. They march around it 7 times. We're told it's only on that day they did it. And it's on the 7th time, verse 16, when the priest had blown the trumpets, Joshua says to the people, shout, right? Rahab's going to be saved, but everything else And verse 18, as for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet and take any of the devoted things, and make the camp of Israel an object for destruction, bringing trouble upon it. Okay, silver, gold, bronze, iron, those are sacred. They're going to go into the treasury. And you're thinking, what treasury? At this point. So the people shouted, the trumpets were blown, right? And what happens? Walls come down, right? And you probably know the corny joke. What note did those trumpets play? Must have been B flat, right? But in any event, down they go. And the people, right, they charge in, and everything is to be destroyed. And this is not necessarily pleasant, but here's what verse 21 says. They devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, men, women, young, old, oxen, sheep, donkeys. Everything is supposed to be, these are the rules of holy war. We'll get to holy war when we get to a later unit. But except for those two guys who were sent in to go rescue Rahab and her family, right? And they bring her out and they keep her safe. And of course, it says, verse 24, that they burned down the city, everything in it, but the silver, the gold, bronze, iron, that they put in the treasury. So we're not sure exactly what that is. It says at verse 25, but Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since. So remember, these are some of the contrasts. It doesn't eliminate all of the difficult passages, but clearly not every single one of the Canaanite peoples are destroyed. Even we have it right here. And of course, then there is a proclamation at the end of chapter 6 that Joshua says, cursed be anyone who tries to rebuild the city. It's going to cost him his firstborn to lay a foundation. It's going to cost him the youngest when the gates are set up. Does Jericho get rebuilt? It does. And maybe you won't be surprised to hear, we'll come to that narrative later on. It happens during the reign of the particularly worst king of all of the northern kingdom of Israel, Ahab, whose wife is Jezebel. We'll get there, but it's interesting that you've got this then, okay? Sounds like things are going well. Chapter 7 quickly indicates it's not, right? Most of your Bibles will have the first word of chapter 7 being but, right? Mine says, but the Israelites broke faith in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah. Judah, that's the tribe that David's going to come from, okay? Took some of the devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the Israelites. Because their next stop, they've got Jericho here. The next stop is going to be this little Ai, which is kind of on a crossroads. And they send spies again. Somebody read 2 through 5, chapter 7.
Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth Aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, go up and spy out the land. And the men went up and spied out Ai. Then they returned to Joshua and said to him, not all these people need to go up. About 2,000 or 3,000 men should go up and attack Ai. Since they are so few, do not make the whole people toil up there. So about 3,000 of the people went up there, and they fled before the men of Ai. The men of Ai killed about 36 of them, chasing them from outside the gate as far as Shebarim, and killing them on the slope. The hearts of the people melted and turned to water.
Uh-oh. Right? So you get these high, low, high, low. We're given a hint, of course, at the beginning of chapter 7, that Achan didn't follow the rules. And so there's going to be trouble. And interestingly enough, the Israelites send out, I mean, there's no conversation about consulting God here. They just think they know what to do. And they send spies. Spies say, yeah, it's a little place. We don't have to all go up there. Let's just have a couple thousand go, 3,000 go. And, you know what, point, 0.36%, right? 36 of the 3,000. Anyway, no, it's a little higher than that. So, but anyway, they're attacked, and now the people are afraid. Pick up, keep reading, 6 to 9.
Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the ground on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening, he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. Joshua said, Ah, Lord God, why have you brought this people across the Jordan at all to hand us over to the Amorites so as to destroy us? Would that we had been content to settle beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say now that Israel has turned their backs to their enemies? The Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it and surrounds us and cut off our name for the earth. Then what will you do for your great name?
Okay, so the fear obviously is we just suffered defeat. And if word gets out about the defeat, they're going to join forces against us. We're done for. Somebody pick up, and that's Joshua's interpretation of what took place. Let's hear what God thinks about it. 10 to 15, somebody.
The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen, they have lied, they have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to the destruction. Go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord chosen has come forward clan by clan. The clan the Lord chooses shall come forward family by family. And the family the Lord chooses shall come forward man by man. Whoever is caught with the devoted thing shall be destroyed by fire, along with all that belongs to him. He has violated the covenant of the Lord and has done an outrageous thing in Israel.
Okay. So Joshua is now appraised of the problem. They didn't follow. And if you want to think about it in some ways, it's this way. If you keep things that are cursed, the curse comes to you as well. Again, obedience is a big deal. We sometimes downplay it, but obedience to God is a big deal. And so here now is the process by which they're going to identify the wrongdoer, right? And if you read this text, again, it's not very savory reading, but the very next morning they get up, they bring they do whatever that they do to determine the tribes, and it's the tribe of Judah. Okay, then they do it next with the clans, and it's the clan of Zerah. And then they do it next within the clan of Zerah, and they get the family of Zabdi. And then they bring Zabdi's family nearby, and Achan is identified. Joshua says, verse 19, my son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel and make confession to him. Tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. Achan said, it's true, I'm the one. I sinned. This is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle, or you might have robe or garment, depending how it translates, from Shinar, that's Babylon, that's way far away. The spoil was beautiful. And there were 200 shekels of silver. There was a bar of gold, and I coveted them. And I took them, and they're in my tent. Right? So Joshua sends people to the tent, they dig around, they find it, and what happens? Yee. Not only is Achan stoned to death, but his whole family clan, right? And here it gives you a sense of, again, this is really foreign to us, but corporate responsibility. This is, man, some of you were educators. Occasionally you discipline the wrongdoer, but sometimes you discipline the group because the group will sometimes support the wrongdoer. You know, I mean, it gets to be, that's kind of what's happening. So it's group punishment here. But by the way, he confesses when he's caught, right? But the thing is there. So if you have Roman Catholic friends, you say, hey, if you have to say 12 Hail Marys and 3 Our Fathers, that's way better than being stoned to death and burned, right? But this is this sense of where God says, visiting the sins of the fathers upon the 3rd and 4th generation. It's this kind of generational punishment. Seems very strange to us, but this is what is referenced here. And of course, after it's all said and done, verse 26, they raise a great heap of stones. And this is now the second pile of stones. The first pile of stones is to remind the people of what God did. The second bigger pile of stones is to say, and don't be messing around with this God stuff. I must have picked up on some of this kind of awesomeness of God because maybe you know this, maybe you don't. One of my first jobs as a young boy was a custodian at church. And when it came time to vacuuming, I would not go behind the altar. I would try to reach that vacuum cleaner as far as I could because I sort of had this sense that if I, you know, that's kind of the holy space in the church building. And if I go back there and I'm not adequately prepared, I could be in big bad trouble. So this is the, you know, the mind of a 10-year-old thinking through some of these Bible stories.
It's bothersome to me that the Lord turned away from his anger because they killed all those people for him.
Yeah, that's some stuff in here, right? It's not good. It's not pleasant. And this is where, again, here's that example, hidden God. I mean, we look at that and say, what the heck is going on here? And we're going to compare, obviously, to what Jesus does. And so, because this is a 60-unit course, you're going to have to suspend. You're going to have to sort of hang on that waiting because we're not going to get to the New Testament for until lesson 40. Okay, so it's going to take us a while. In fact, not even until lesson 41. But anyway, yeah, it's going to take us a while to get here. But here's that hidden God. This is not very comforting. But until the evil is dealt with, it's not good. It's not good. And of course, go ahead, please.
Do you know if all when they pile up rocks, I know in one place they refer to it as an Ebenezer, like a thing of remembering. Is that true?
No, that's just in that one instance where it's referenced. Yep. And that's actually a place where there was a help in the midst of a battle. Yeah, Ebenezer means rock of my help. That's what the word means.
That's ironic when you get to the Christmas story with the Christmas Carol, that he's also Ebenezer, because he's not.
Oh, Ebenezer Scrooge. Yes. Yes.
Back in that era, because it was more pervasively Christian, that like that influenced it somehow.
Well, that was the disconnect. You know, he's supposed to be, Ebenezer is a wonderful, so somebody named Ebenezer's supposed to be a wonderful person, and he was not. Yeah, I mean, that's probably that contrast there. So, well, now chapter 8 describes how AI is going to be captured and destroyed, right? God says to Joshua, don't you fear, don't be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you. Go up to Ai. I've handed it over to you, right? And what are they going to do? Did you get a chance to read that chapter? What's that?
Oh, I was gonna say, this time they get to keep everything.
Yeah, but yes, right. They set the ambush, right? So they put some of the troops off to the side that they don't know about, And then the strategy is you're gonna go up like you did before. They're gonna come out and attack. You're gonna run away like you did the last time, but the runaway this time is to draw the people out, because then the ones who were in ambush will go in, set the city on fire, and then they'll come and attack. And so now it's a conquest in that manner, right? So this is what happens. They go up, they attack, and they're able then to destroy, right? And let's see here. What? Yeah, somebody read, I mean, it's kind of starts nasty, but gets better at the end. Somebody take 24 through 29 of chapter 8.
Israel had finished slaughtering all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, and when all of them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword, all Israel returned to Ai and attacked it with the edge of the sword. The total of those who fell that day, both men and women, was 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the sword until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Only the livestock and the spoil of that city Israel took as their booty, according to the word of the Lord that he had issued to Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree, threw it down at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day.
Yeah, there's that stands there till this day. So you get a sense of it being reported back. The numbers are interesting, 12,000. And so it gets you thinking they may have been pretty cocky when they said, we only need 2,000 or 3,000 to take down 12,000. That's sort of interesting. But again, it's total destruction of the people. So there's no way to make this kind of palatable in that sense. What's that?
It's a lesson of obedience.
Well, it is, but
Genesis, when Ham went to all of these people and everything there, I mean, it's all traveling through Ham and Canaanites and the Amorites, they're all.
it's carried down through and it's referenced. Yep. But I don't, and this is just me personally, I don't ever want to be comfortable with these passages of destruction.
No.
I always want them to bother me to some level. But yes.
Law and the gospel.
And when you, and that, yeah, let me piggyback on that a little bit. When you then take that destruction seriously, it does give you, if you will, a deeper appreciation of what God has done for us in Christ, because this is what we deserve because of our sin. So now that's that revealed God. But it, again, there's always, I think, going to be an edge to it. And then what's interesting, somebody read chapter, the last from verse 30 to the end of the chapter.
And Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of unhewn stones on which no iron tool has been used. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed offerings of well-being. And there in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. I turned too many pages.
Oh, yeah.
All Israel, alien as well as citizen, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark in front of the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of the Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first, that they should bless the people of Israel. And afterward, he read all the words of the law, blessings and curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the aliens who resided among them.
All right, so keep your finger here and go back to Deuteronomy chapter 27. And it's at the end of chapter 27. All right, really is we'll look at the whole part. I'll read. It says, Moses and the elders charged all the people as follows: keep the entire commandment, right? Not just part of it. Keep the whole commandment, the entire commandment that I'm commanding you this day. On the day that you cross over the Jordan into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones and cover them with plaster. You shall write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over to enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. So when you have crossed over the Jordan, you shall set up these stones about which I am commanding you today on Mount Ebal. Okay, there's the reference. And you shall cover them with plaster, and you shall build an altar there to the Lord your God, an altar of stones on which you have not used an iron tool. You must build the altar of the Lord your God of unhewn stones, then offer up burnt offerings to the Lord your God, make sacrifices of well-being, eat them there, rejoicing before the Lord your God. You shall write on the stones all the words of this law very clearly, right? So this is the reference point of, and you can see it continues on to talk about the curses, but go back then. So here they are at Mount Ebal. Joshua chapter 8, verse 30. And they build this altar of unhewn stones, just like they were told. And they offered burnt offerings on it, right? And Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law. So this raises as many questions as it answers. I mean, which is this? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? I mean, what is it? Is it just Deuteronomy? I mean, we don't know, but and that's a lot of writing. And so he either wrote very fast, or he had help, or it's just trying to. And it says clearly, right? So it had to be good penmanship. Yeah, good point. Good point. But here's the other thing. Look at verse 33. Does anything strike you as really odd or interesting? They're not all Israelites, right? Some translations say alien. What other words do you have? Foreigners. Okay, remember, we're even told when they came up out of Egypt that there was a mixed host. And so we don't have precision in understanding all this. But here's a passage that tells us that not all the foreigners are wiped out. Doesn't eliminate the fact that in the previous chapter we just read about how 12,000 men, women, and children, young and old, were killed. Okay, so it doesn't wipe it all, but it is interesting that they are able to participate. And half of them stand with their backs to Mount Gerizim, half of them stand with their backs to Mount Ebal, and they do these blessings and curses, right? And it says, verse 34, afterwards he read all the words of the law, the blessings and curses, according to all that's written in the book of the law. There was not a word that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before the assembly, and the women, and the little ones, and the aliens, right? So, I mean, this is a big, giant worship experience, and everybody's there. So don't be complaining about 67 or 68 or 75 minutes because this took longer than that. Right. No, I mean, but this is the picture that's given, right? So it's just really interesting. And there's not enough information to get it completely figured out. But it clearly is not the total annihilation and destruction of anything non-Israelite. That isn't what happened. And in fact, chapter 9 makes that point quite clearly. Because word's getting out, right? Somebody must have posted it on their social media. And now everybody's freaked. Because we're told, somebody read the first verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9.
Now, when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland, all along the coast, the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites heard of this. They gathered together with one accord to fight Joshua and Israel.
All right, so now what's going to happen? It's mass collection of peoples. And how many peoples are listed here? I think this one only has 6, right? So the reaction of some of the people in the land is, let's join forces. If we don't join forces, we're just going to get obliterated. Let's join forces and fight against it. But another group of people had a different strategy. What did the Gibeonites do? Yeah, they tricked them. How?
You know, looking like they had traveled many, many miles.
Yeah, right. They wore old, worn out clothes. They had old, gross food, and their shoes had holes in their sandals. Their sandals had holes in them, and they made it look like they had traveled from a far distance away. Because what was the commandment about holy war? Somebody who lives outside of the land of Israel, you can make treaties with, but any of those foreigners who live inside of the land, you got to completely wipe them out. And so the Gibeonites fooled them. And interestingly enough, if you read the text, we won't spend much time with it except summarizing it. They never consulted God. They just went what they saw with their eyes. They said, "Oh man, look at that old bread. Look at that moldy cheese. Look at the poor busted up, dried out water skins and wine skins. You guys really did. Well, we'll make a treaty with you." And they must be thinking to themselves, wow, our fame has spread so broad that even people who don't even live in the land are hearing about how awesome we are and our God. And so we'll make a treaty with them, and they do. And then they find out just a few days later, they live within the land, right? And so Gibeon is the largest of the cities. There's a little cluster of cities there. But once they discover this, they kept their bargain, right? Verse 18, it said, well, somebody read 16 through 21.
But when 3 days had passed after they had made a treaty with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and were living among them. So the Israelites set out and reached their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, C, B, KJ. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders, but all the leaders said to all the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we must not touch them. This is what we will do to them. We will let them live so that wrath may not come upon us because of the oath that we swore to them." The leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, as the leaders had decided concerning them.
Okay, so they're going to keep their word. And that little phrase about hewers of wood and drawers of water will show up again. They're going to basically be a servant class, if you will. And they have a little reckoning and conversation about it, but that's what it is. But notice how it ends up being. Verse 27 then says, Joshua made them hewers of wood, drawers of water for the congregation to continue to this day in the place that he should choose. Hear that Deuteronomy language? In the place that he should choose. Well, now, when some of the neighboring tribes have heard what the Gibeonites did, they rise up to fight the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites send out for help. The Israelites come to help them and they rescue them. And this is where you get that passage about how the sun stands still, right? And is this also the one where they get the hail? No. I think that comes later. But so God intervenes in the, if you will, in the normal course and passage of the day, and they are rescued. The Gibeonites are rescued, and then they go on to fight against those southern kings. So here then in your map on your illustration, this is where it is. Right here's Gibeon and the other places, but these kings are fighting. So now, boom, they go down there and they wipe them out. And again, we don't have generally as much difficulty in understanding that kind of passage, right? Because here they were coming to someone's rescue. Well, there's one more, chapter 11, where these northern kings, and it mentions King Jabin of Hatzor, and you see Hatzor way up here in the north. And so he gets together with a bunch of people and they go to battle. And they are handed over. And they are struck down. And at the end of chapter 11, we have a summary of all of the fighting. And somebody take chapter 11, verse 16 to the end and be gracious and free to just use letters for some of the place names. But you can certainly try and pronounce them if you'd like. So chapter 11, 16 to the end.
So Joshua took this entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, to Baal Gad, in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and put them to death. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron to Beer, Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them in their towns. No Anakites were left in Israel territory, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did they survive. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to their tribal divisions. And the land had rest from war.
You see that last phrase? It's the first time it shows up. It's going to show up a few other places. Makes it sound like this little summary makes it sound like it's all done, right? Well, I think you'll see both with Joshua and when we get to Judges that this may be a little idealized here. But you've got kind of this whole sense of all these people wiped out. By the way, did you notice the cities at the end of verse 22? Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. You got any bells or lights go off there? Gaza, yeah. Yeah, some of that same territory. And the Anakim, those are the giants. But what about a biblical connection with Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod? We'll come across those when we get to Samuel. Those are 3 of the 5 Philistine cities. So who don't they get, already hinting in Joshua that they've kind of cleared the land, but there's these 3 cities here that are still going to cause some problems. And so we're there. Chapter 12 then is a summary to begin with for what Moses has done. And then starting in verse 7, a listing of all the kings that have been, 31 of them, in fact. And then chapter 13, somebody read the first 7 verses.
When Joshua was an old man, the Lord said to him, "You are growing old, and much land remains to be conquered. The people still need to occupy the land of the Philistines and the Geshurites, territory that belongs to the Canaanites. The land extends from the stream of Shishor, which is the boundary of Egypt, northward to the boundary of Ekron, and includes the 5 Philistine cities of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. The land of the Avites in the south also remains to be conquered. In the north, this area has not yet been conquered. All the land of the Canaanites, including Mira, which belongs to the Sidonites, stretching northward to Aphek, at the border of the Amorites, the land of the Gebulites, and all of the Lebanon mountain area to the east, from Baal-Gad beneath Mount Hermon to Lebo Hamath, and all the hill country from Lebanon to Mis to Em, including all of the land of the Sidonites. We will drive these people out of the land for the Israelites. Be sure to give this land to Israel as a special possession, just as I have commanded you. Include all this territory as Israel's inheritance when you divide the land among the 9 tribes and the half tribe of Esau."
So is the land all conquered? Well, this certainly suggests not. So again, it doesn't explain away the unpleasantness of some of the stuff we've read, but it does set it up to say, I don't know, right? The land had rest from war. Well, apparently not.
Well, and rest could mean like a pause.
It could be, but
Pause from work, take a deep breath, eat some dinner, take a nap,
yeah.
go back at it tomorrow.
But what begins now in the middle of chapter 13 and continues for the next several chapters is the division of the land, right? And so it talks about those 2.5 tribes. It talks about Reuben, it's starting at verse 15, then the territory of Gad, and then the half tribe of Manasseh on the east. Then you get distribution on the west. You've got land given to Caleb, right? Caleb and Joshua were the 2 that were allowed to go in, right? And so Caleb is given that. Then chapter 15 talks about Judah, and again Caleb, and some towns in Judah. Chapter 16 talks about Ephraim. And by the way, look at some of these. Well, I'll keep going. I'll come back to it. Chapter 17, you got the other half tribe of Manasseh, right? Then you've got some other tribes in chapter 18 with Benjamin and others. 19, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan. And then finally Joshua gets something at the end of chapter 19. So there's lots of there's really only 5 chapters that talk about the conquest. And then you've got multiple chapters here. But look at the end of chapter 14. The final sentence is what? The land had rest from war, right? And yet you hear something like this. Look at verse 63 of the last verse of chapter 15. But the people of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites live with the people of Judah in Jerusalem to this day. And so that kind of repetition will show up from time to time.
Does this include the Jewish Israelites today?
Yeah, there's a mixed answer to that, because some will see that this promise of the land that we read about here extends forever to include Israel today, and the Israelis who hold that view, that's why they don't care about the so-called occupied territories, because these other people are living in this land. God gave it to us. We're going to take it.
But it's also clearly as long as you are obeying God.
Yep, it is complex. And is the nation of Israel today equivalent to the Israel we read about here? And so you'll have different debates about that. But there's a long history of both Jew and non-Jew taking these texts and applying them to themselves, right? I mean, the whole back to your American history, the whole manifest destiny that the white man who came to the new promised land had the right to wipe out the inhabitants of the land because they were holding up. I mean, this is some of the language was used to justify what was done to the Native Americans who lived. Or you go to Southern Africa, and some of the same language was used when the Europeans went down to South Africa and began to push out the people from the land there. So there's it's complex, and it's not always done well. And we have to own up to that kind of thing. But you get this sense that there's parts of Joshua that seem to suggest that the conquest was swift, that they completely wiped out all the Canaanites. And it may have been brutal, but it's done and over with. But then you get these other passages that seem to hint that it's not quite that way. We got a little bit of time. Let's go ahead to chapter 20. And in chapter 20, they've got these cities of refuge that were talked about before, right? These are places where if somebody accidentally kills someone, they can flee to that city and look for justice to come without being murdered by an avenger from the family. And then chapter 21, you've got the Levites. They get towns. They don't necessarily get territory, but they get areas that they get to live in. In chapter 22, the eastern tribes go back home to their inheritance, but they build this altar right before they cross that causes some controversy. So that's what this thing is here. And so much so righteously angry are the 9.5 tribes when they see this altar there that they're willing to go across and wipe out their brethren, so to speak, until they say, whoa, no, you don't understand. We built this big giant altar not because we want to offer sacrifice on it, but it's to be a memorial, it's to be a reminder, it's to be a connection that you remember we're part of you, even though we're on the other side of the river. And the one thing that I personally have never heard a good explanation for, that would seem to make a heck of a lot of sense if it was on the other side of the river. But I don't know exactly how, but it's clearly on the opposite side.
Where they cross the river is not where John the Baptist.
Well, yes, and then we'll walk through the text real quick too. But yes, that very likely it's down in this area that John the Baptist is doing his work. And of course, that the historical connection for that is huge, because John will say, don't say to yourselves, we're children of Abraham. He says, hey, God can raise up from these stones children to Abraham, so that your connection to God is not because of your ethnic heritage, which of course, there's the whole opening up of things when we get to the New Testament. But let's go ahead and get to the end here quick. And we'll finish up with Joshua and go back and look at the text. But in chapter 23 now, it's Joshua's turn to give a farewell speech, right? And just like Moses did in Deuteronomy, he wants to emphasize some things. So I'll read a little bit, but then I have somebody jump in at 14. But verse 2, it says, Joshua summoned all Israel, their elders, their heads, their judges, officers, said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years. You've seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you, right? I've given you this inheritance. And you get this sense already, right? That, where does it go? Let's see. I've allotted you as inheritance for your tribes, those nations that remain, along with all the nations I've already cut off. So there's been some battles, but it certainly hasn't completely done everything. Verse 5, the Lord your God will push them back and drive them out, and you shall be steadfast to observe all these commandments, right? And then verse 7, so that you may not be mixed with these nations left here among you, or mention the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down yourselves to them, right? Hear the injunction against idolatry, right? Be very careful to love the Lord, because verse 12, if you turn back and join the survivors, if you intermarry with them, know that the Lord will not continue to drive out the nations. They will be a snare for you, thorns for your eyes, until you perish from the good land that the Lord your God has given you. Again, you can read it kind of two ways. It's Joshua warning them about what might come, or someone relating Joshua's words to say, see, this is why all this bad stuff has happened to us, because we didn't listen to what Joshua said. But somebody read 14 to the end of the chapter.
Now I'm about to go. Somebody else.
Okay. Go.
Now I'm about to go to the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. But just as all the other things the Lord your God has promised, you have come to you, how he will bring on you all the evil things he has threatened, until the Lord your God has destroyed you from good land he has given you. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you to go and serve others' gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you.
Right? So don't think you're exempt. Chapter 24. Joshua gathers all the tribe to Shechem. There we are again. And here Shechem's still circled. They're gathered to Shechem. Who's gathered? Well, it says all the tribes. It talks about the elders, the heads, the judges, the officers, right? They present themselves, and Joshua says to them all, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, which is preamble. What comes next? Historical prologue. Long ago, your ancestors, Terah, Abraham, Nahor, right? They lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. I took your father Abraham, led him through the land, made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac. Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country. Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. I sent Moses and Aaron. I plagued. I mean, it's a repetition of all the things that have happened, right? Verse 6, I brought your ancestors out of Egypt. You came to the sea. The Egyptians pursued you. They cried out, verse 7, he put darkness between you. Then I brought you across the water, right? I brought you through the wilderness. Then I brought you into the land of the Amorites who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you. I handed them over to you, right? Talks about Balak and all those people, and talks about verse 11, when you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, they fought against you. And then there's a list of people, right? Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, Jebusites. There you got 7, I think. And I handed them over you. I sent the hornet ahead of you, right? All this stuff, right? much longer historical prologue than we had. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Because what comes after the historical prologue? The stipulations. Therefore, revere the Lord, serve him with sincerity, serve him in faithfulness, put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river, in Egypt, right? Put away the foreign gods. And if you're unwilling to serve the Lord, pick who you're going to serve. You got to serve somebody. And of course, the famous line from here is, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Hear this covenant renewal? It's that covenant language. Because the people say, oh, no, 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 no. Far be it from us. I love that Bible phrase. Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord, serve other God. It's God who brought us, right? Brought our ancestors up. He did these great signs. He protected us, right? The Lord drove out the peoples. We also will serve the Lord. So there's their declaration. Joshua warns them, you can't serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm, right? This is not friendly, happy, soft, plushy, what do they call them now? We call them stuffed animals. They're just called stuffies now, right? The people said, no, 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 we will serve the Lord, right? Joshua said, you are witnesses that you have chosen, right? And they say, yeah, we're witnesses. And so he says, here it is again, put away the foreign gods that are among you. Get it? They're not clean already. Incline your hearts to the Lord. The people says, we will serve him. We will obey him. And then it says specifically, he made a covenant with them. Statutes, ordinances. He wrote the words in the book of law. Write it down. Preservation, rereading, right? And he took a large stone, set it up under the oak. He said, this stone shall be a witness. Here's at the end of Joshua is a renewing of the covenant. And then we're told in verse 29 that he died and that they buried him. And then a rather ominous verse. Somebody read verse 31.
Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the portion of ground that Jacob had bought from the children of Hamor, the father of Shechem. For 100 pieces of money, it became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. Eleazar, son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, the town of his son Phinehas, which had been given him in the hill country of Ephraim.
So it sounds like, and they lived happily ever after, which is the way Genesis ended. And then we turn to Exodus and it says, but a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, right? So Joshua ends, so it seems, with everything in good order. But it also, verse 31 sort of suggests that there was a little bit of a if or a but to their service, right? They served the Lord all the days of Joshua, all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who saw what God had done. And you get the kind of sense, okay, but what happens after that? And the very final phrase is Eleazar, son of Aaron, dies. And so it's kind of a little cliffhanger, but you'll get a chance to read Judges next time. Let's go back to the text that's in your manual. Page 15 is essentially just a walkthrough of the illustration, which we sort of did already. And on 16 and 17, it's a little bit of the setup. And we read through those passages of God commissioning Joshua. You know, it's got to be a united Israel. The spies are sent, these kinds of things. But number 9 on page 17 is central, that God is the commander. Joshua is his general. Okay. Any questions with that? That's pretty straightforward. Then on pages 18, 19, you have the campaigns outlined, right? And so the first campaign is this little circle here in and around Jericho and Ai. Then the second campaign is down here in this lower area. And the third campaign then is finally up in the north. But this is what's interesting. Somebody read point 1 on the bottom of page 19.
According to the account outlined above, Joshua was the leader of a united Israel. He planned and led 3 lightning attacks into the center, the southern, and the northern areas of Canaan, thus enabling the Israelites to take complete possession of the land. The campaign was a violent one. Cities were razed. The native Canaanite population was all but exterminated. The Israelites swept everything away as they advanced. Joshua 10:40-42 and 11:16-23 suggests that the conquest was thorough and complete.
Okay, so on one level, you could read the text and come to that sort of conclusion. And the nastiness is still kind of there with that extermination, but it sounds like it's over and done. However, somebody read point 2.
However, there are hints within the book itself that the whole procedure was not as simple and the sweep not as clean as suggested. Indications are that much more needed to be done before the Israelites could claim that the land had rest from war. Several passages state that the Israelites were unable to expel the Canaanites from a number of places. According to Judges 1:1, after Joshua dies, the people ask, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?"
So there's your little cliffhanger hint. That's your very first verse in the next book. So no for sure. And then finally, number 3. I'll read. Even more significant is the account of the conquest recorded in Judges 1:1 to 3:6. It'll be studied in Unit 13, which we get to next. Joshua 18 gives the impression that the conquest was carried out along the lines suggested in Judges 1. And so just as, and again, you got to be careful the language you use, but just as there are Genesis 1:1 through 2:4, which talks about God speaking creation into existence, and Genesis 2 talking about God forming the creatures and the people. You've got some different voices here, and so we're gonna see that when we get to that. But I believe that's an important little section in here. The division of the land, we talked about that a little bit, and the cities of refuge. Some of those things. So just be aware of that. And then some reference to the covenant at Shechem in chapter 24 that we kind of read through. But that's a place where pretty much all 6 of those parts of the covenant are apparent. Doesn't talk tons about the blessing, doesn't use the word blessing and curse, but it does talk about how bad things are going to happen. But here's what's sort of interesting, and we'll end with this. Internationally, what's going on? Well, it's interesting that this land here that we see is, again, Egypt to the south, and then you've got all of Mesopotamia up in the north. It's interesting that it was during this period of history that many of those surrounding nations were particularly weak. There was no real dominant power in the region. And so it is interesting, and I love that's what point 3 is. At the time of the Israelite invasion, and for some time afterwards, Canaan was a political power vacuum. From a human point of view, this made the Israelite invasion of Canaan possible. From a theological point of view, God can use all aspects of human history to accomplish his purposes. We'll get a similar kind of thing pointed out when we get to Jesus. Because Jesus is born during a time in which the so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had exercised much stability in and around that area. And the Roman roads and the protection of the Roman roads allowed for the disciples and others to go out into the world to spread the good news of Jesus. And Paul will reference this in Galatians when he says that God, or that the Son of God was born at the right time. Right. So anyway, we will close ourselves off there and go to our prayers here before I cancel the recording, and then I'll hang around if you got some questions. But let's pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody.